CB Super. Today I want to go over motion paths and animating text and objects on a motion path inside of DaVinci Resolve 16.1. Let's go ahead and jump in. Alright, so I already have two fusion compositions. They're both the same, or they're similar. They're just 5 seconds long. This first one is where we're going to animate some text, which is super easy. And then the second one, I just have an image of a top-down car that I've rotoed out, and then we'll just animate that over a motion path. So jumping into the Fusion comp where we're going to build some text, you'll notice I already have a couple nodes set up here. All I have is a merge node, a background node, and the media out. So all I have to do is bring in a text node and connect it to the merge node. Notice that it's in the foreground because it's green and it's in the foreground input, and the background is in the background input with the merge node. Over into the inspector, and in the style text we're going to go ahead and type in CB Super, surprise surprise. In order to animate this, it's really simple. Just next to the text icon is the layout icon. If I click on that, it brings me to the next viewer over. Over where it says type, change it from point to path. Now it's going to allow me to create a new path. Just note that if you do click back on here, it's going to change and modify your layout, or it's going to add another point. So if I was to click over here, it's going to add another point. So in order to just get out of that, you can either hit Shift N, or you can come up to this little icon where it says Done. And if you want to remodify it again, you can just Shift M. So maybe I want to smooth these out just a little bit. I can select all of the points, hit Shift S, that'll smooth them out. And now we can see what we have here. Okay, so nothing is animating, and that's because the animation actually takes place on this position on path. So if we want to start it maybe on frame 1, I just push this slider over and then key this little keyframe over here on the right, and maybe I go to frame 30 and I want to make it go all the way to the other side of the screen. Alright, now from frame 0 to 30 we're going to have this animation where it's going to go up and over the little mound there. You'll notice there's no motion blur. If you do want motion blur on this, it's pretty simple. Just come over here to the settings inside of the text tab and click on motion blur. Now you notice it's going to be very hard to read, so I mean you may want to drop the shutter angle down just a little bit, and you can always turn quality up just to make it look a little nicer. And now you'll see you got a little bit of motion blur. If that's not enough, just up the shutter angle a little bit and it'll look like it's going on this little like roller coaster. So that's text. Text is really simple and it's that easy. So let's jump over to the next Fusion comp where we're going to animate this car. Okay, so here we are over in Fusion, and I've actually changed out the car to this red car that doesn't require any roto. It doesn't look very realistic, but at the same time it has a transparent background. It's on a PNG, so I don't have to do any roto for it. I'm going to be using this little cutout from some stock image that I found, and that's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and jump in and animate this path. Okay, so the first thing we're going to want to do is we're actually going to want to resize this. You'll notice that this is 1688 by 891. Our composition is actually 1920 by 1080. So all I have to do is on the media in, shift space, type in resize. And that's automatically going to resize it to usually the composition size, which in our case is 1920 by 1080. Alright, and so now you can see we actually have a 1920 by 1080 car. And now we can come back in and we can XF, transform, and now we can actually like start sizing that down a little if we need to. So it looks like it might have stretched it just slightly, so I'm just gonna bring it back in just a little bit, just the eye. I'm actually going to flip it, so I might as well do that right now. So with the merge node in here, I can pipe this in. It's going to be in the background. This is going to be in the foreground, piped out to the media out, and you'll see our car is massive. So our media over here, this one, right now this is the background, so this is the size essentially of our comp. And so what we're going to want to do is actually we're going to resize that as well. And now we're starting to get kind of where we want to be. With the transform, you can go ahead and size it down a little bit more. We don't need to make it like the accurate size just yet. You just bring it, make it a little bit smaller. If you want, you could bring it in and start adjusting the color space that it's in. You could composite it to your background. You could do all the things that you would normally do in a compositing. We're not going to do any of that today. We're just going to leave the car as it is. We're going to start animating a path for this car to animate on. All right, using this as just kind of a background, I'm going to go ahead and quickly, with nothing clicked on, use this polygon tool. Don't use this this B-spline. When you use the B-spline, it does some really weird things that will affect your animation, and it's really hard to like animate it correctly if you want to add in a heading. So using the polygon tool, I'm probably just going to fast forward this, but I'm just going to make a nice little path for this car to go on. That path is pretty much done. If I was to click over here, it's going to keep creating paths, and I don't want more points on here. There's a little icon up here. There's a little lock next to it. It's the done. If you just either click that, or you hit the hotkey of Shift N, and it'll go ahead and get out of that, and then Shift M if you want to get back into it. And while I have this, I might as well select all the points. Shift S will smooth them out. Then I can go back to the done and leave it there. If I want to modify it some more, I can also come back over here and I can move these points around. And as long as I haven't started animating yet, I can pretty much move these points any way I want, just to kind of like, adjust my animation before I start actually animating it. And of course, like, for your project, you're going to want to take a lot more time in this animation. You're also going to probably want to use less points. The more points you have, the more opportunity for the animation to look a little weird. You'll notice when I did the demo, there's a couple times where the car kind of like spins out of control, and that's because it's hitting one of these points, and it's just doing like weird things because it's following the heading, and you'll see what I mean by heading here in just a minute. And we can just kind of adjust these just a little bit, just to maybe push it a little bit farther off screen. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and lock that in, so now it's all done. So in order to use this polygon as a path, I'm going to have to do a couple things to it. Load it up into the inspector, come over where it says right click here for shape animation, and you're going to right click, come down and remove polygon polyline, and then right click again and come over to publish. And now we really don't need to do anything else with it. We can actually move it off to the side. We're not actually going to be connecting anything directly to the node itself. We're just going to be using the node. In fact, one thing we might want to do is we actually might want to rename it. So F2 will rename, and we can just call it path. Just in case you have any other polygons, you don't want to mix them up, and you want to kind of keep it separate so you can always know that the path is the polygon that is going to be affected in the transform node. So most of the animating is going to take place in this transform node, so I'm going to go load up the transform node, and I'm going to load back in my car just so we can kind of see what's going on. Alright, so in the transform node, the center is where all of the animation is mostly going to take place. So I'm going to want to right click, come down to path, and once I do that, once I click on that path, you'll notice it loaded up some modifiers. I can come over to the modifier tab. You'll see that, again, right down here where it says right click here for animation shape. Well, first off, actually, before we even do that, let's take a look at where our playhead is. It's somewhere right around 43, and there's already a keyframe because it already automatically loads a keyframe up into displacement, which is kind of annoying, but not a big deal. Just make sure that if you're not where you want to be, and say you want to start this animation at 0, then just move back over to 0 and then rekey it. But to be honest, before we even keyframe it, let's go ahead and right click here for shape animation, and we're going to connect it. So down here where it says connect to, path, polyline, and then value. Alright, and you'll notice that it shoved it all the way at the beginning of your line. And so for whatever reason, if you weren't really thinking about this when you started your path, if you wanted it to start on the other side and come from the other direction, you can come back up here into the path, double click, and you could just move the displacement all the way to the other side. That way you'll just move it this direction instead of the other direction. But for us, we're just going to start it over here. In the beginning, I can go ahead and key that frame over on displacement, drive all the way to the end of the animation, and then move the displacement all the way to the right. And that's just going to push it all along this path. One thing I didn't really talk about is this this resize. Why did I do this resize? Well, I resized it because if you look at this media, it's a different size. So if I didn't use this resize node, if I was to just, I can Command P, which is going to kind of turn that node off for a second, and then when I click on this, you'll see on the transform, the polyline has actually moved. It's no longer on the road. It's changed to, it's basically smaller, and what it's doing is it's taking the size from this 1688 by 891, and it's using that as the driver for the path line, which is not what we want. And this is kind of like a lesson for almost all bringing in media, and anytime you're going to be doing graphics, motion graphics or visual effects, whenever you bring in some kind of media, some kind of asset, you're always going to want to resize it to whatever you want it to actually be. In order to get this back to the right size, just come back over here, Command P, and that's why we do the resize. So now that the line will stay, on the correct size, the 1920 by 1080 size that we're looking to do. Same with this resize down here. We resized this media because it wasn't the right size for the composition that we're working in, which is a 1920 by 1080 composition. Alright, so that done, let's go back somewhere in the center here and let's see if we can figure out how to change the direction that this car is facing. Because we have the animation now, it's animating along the path, which is cool, but of course the car is facing in the wrong direction. It's heading in the wrong direction. If we actually come over here, double click back on the transform in the tools section, over here where it says angle, well, we can change the angle, and the angle will change which direction the car is facing. So let me go ahead and Command Z that to undo that. So now I can come over and I can right click on angle, come down to connect to path, but instead of displacement we want to use heading. And now you'll see that the car is now heading in the direction that I want it to go. And if that is not the correct direction, say you wanted it to go the other direction, of course you can still flip it and now it will head in that direction that you wanted it to do, if that was the direction that you originally wanted to go in. So super powerful right there. That saves you like probably at least an hour or two of animation just right there alone. So that's pretty cool. Now the car is going to, if I preview it, it's going to head in the direction that I want it to. It looks hilarious because it's so big, but once we size it down, and the nice thing is since we're not animating the transforms per se, I can size it down by holding down the command while I'm sizing it down a little bit. It'll move in smaller increments, because if I don't have the command down, it might size a little too quickly. So here I can kind of fine tune it. I mean, you can look at the road, and I think on one of the other shots you can see that there was actually a car on the road, so we kind of have some kind of frame of reference. I mean, realistically, I mean, even that is kind of big. I mean, that car is still the same size as almost the road, so if we command and hold it down just a little bit more, we can make it even smaller. And that's probably good enough. Let me go ahead and scroll out here. Let me stop that. Get it off here so you can kind of see it. So now, I mean, it's moving pretty fast. It's a pretty fast animation, but at least it is. It actually looks kind of hilarious. One thing I will say though is that when it crosses, you'll notice that it's driving over the tops of these trees. So look, like right here, you can see it's driving over the tree, and the effect is kind of spoiled. I mean, barring that we didn't do any kind of color correction or anything to the car, we could blur it up, and that would kind of make it a little bit better. But we probably need to fix that, because the effect is completely just falls apart when you see that it's driving over the tops of these white trees. There's a really easy way to do that, actually, and it's easy because we're using this particular background, which is almost white and black already. So, I mean, you probably can already figure out what we're going to do. We can take this resize and media, and we can actually create a mask using a bitmap out of this picture, so that the car will be obscured every time it goes behind these trees. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and bring out shift space. We'll bring out a bitmap, and then we'll do shift space. We'll also bring out a color correction node. All right, so we don't want it connected like that. We actually want to pipe out from the resize because we want to be the right correct size, and then grabbing that gray box, driving it into the bitmap. We can come over to the color correction node. We can drop the saturation because, believe it or not, it does have like some blue in there. So we can drop the saturation all the way down, and you can kind of play with these. You know, you can bring the contrast up. You can play with all of these settings till your heart's content to get, you know, good nice blacks with good whites. You're probably not going to get it perfect, but you may get it to a point where it's good enough, and sometimes good enough is good enough. So inside of this bitmap, you'll notice there isn't really an alpha here, or the alpha is just all white. So in order to get something that we can actually use, we can actually come over here where it says alpha and channel, maybe change it to like the red channel. So once we change it over to the red channel, come up here and you can click on the alpha, and you'll see that is now the alpha, which is exactly what we want. And now we can drive this holding the right. If you hold the right mouse button down when you grab the little output and you drop it into the merge node, you can actually pick the effect mask. You can also use the Alt key if you wanted to, or you could just drop it right into that little blue triangle. Now in the merge, you can either come to the bit node or the bitmap here, and you could either use this inversion. Let's come up here real quick. You can either invert it by just inverting right here, or if you have a bunch of different nodes that are all going into this merge, you can come over to the merge itself, over to this far settings tab, and then just apply mask inverted, and that'll just apply all masks that are coming in, and it'll invert it. Preferably I like to just kind of control it right here by inverting it. Now you'll see that when we come over here, the car is actually being obscured by the trees somewhat. There's still like a little bit of transparency going through, which is kind of what you want. I mean, it wouldn't be 100% hidden, and if you wanted it more hidden, you could of course do some kind of core matte masking. You could also just adjust your color correction parameters so that it's more black and more white. And that's pretty much it, what I did for, you know, this one. But, you know, it's kind of nice. It gives it like a slight amount of realism. You know, obviously, again, we didn't color correct it, which maybe we should just do that, you know, just to finish it off. One thing you can do, though, is you can actually come into this transform, because the transform is kind of where all of the action is taking place, and you can use motion blur. And you can turn the quality probably all the way up to 10, and kind of come in here and look. That's probably too much. You can probably drop some of that shutter angle. Which is nice, because you would naturally want to blur it out anyways, because it was a pretty sharp object. Let's go ahead and zoom in on the car here. Now that's with the motion blur. We'll turn the motion blur off for a minute. Alright, so in front of the transform, but behind the resize, let's go ahead and shift space and do a color correction node. And then we're going to pipe this, this resize actually into this mask, because we're only going to want to affect this car. We don't want to affect all the other things that are taking place over here. Also interesting to note is that because we masked it and there's a white line here, like you can actually see the white line on the car, which you don't really probably want, but in order to fix that, you'd have to go in and you'd have to do like a little core matte masking, because there is white, you know, that white line is there, and you're not gonna be able to get rid of that white line unless you paint it out or something. So, and you kind of need the white line there. So you may want to have to do a core matte just for the road if you wanted to do this, you know, correctly and, you know, better than what we've done here. We can bring this saturation down a little bit because it's a little oversaturated. You could change the color of the car if you want, which is kind of cool. Maybe we'll change it to like this green. Definitely bringing the contrast down just a little bit. You just want to kind of match it up as best you can. And even then, it's so one thing I would definitely add is some blur, but because we have this motion blur, when we turn the motion blur back on, it's kind of already blurring it to the point where if I was to blur it even more, it might be, you know, kind of silly. So, I mean, we would just play that. That's, you know, that's, I mean, the animation itself still needs a lot of finessing, and you could do a lot of that in the spline editor. Just for the purposes of showing you how to use this animating along a motion path, I think what we got here is probably good enough. So I hope that helped you guys. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.